And you best believe these owners are going to be scouring the market for who can reel in the big fish, the biggest fish of them all, Caitlin Clark. Take a look here. This is crazy. It is going down, y'all. It's going down like Young Jock. I keep trying to tell you. Sparks agreed to part ways with general manager Reagan Pebley. The LA Sparks have agreed to part ways with general manager effective today.
Something is happening inside the Indiana Fever organization right now, and the people closest to professional basketball know it. Not the loud, chaotic version being screamed across social media, the real version, the quiet, uncomfortable one that front offices don't want discussed on camera and coaches won't touch in press conferences. Because the truth about Caitlin Clark's future in Indiana is far more complicated, far more fascinating, and honestly, far more alarming than anything you've seen in a highlight reel or a clickbait thumbnail. And once you understand the full picture, you're going to look at this entire situation completely differently. The question isn't whether Caitlin Clark is the most valuable player in the WNBA right now. That debate is over. The question that nobody in a position of power wants to answer directly is this: is Indiana actually built to maximize what she is? And if the honest answer to that question is no, then everything that follows becomes one of the most fascinating power struggles in modern sports history. For most of the past season, there was this strange, unspoken tension floating around the Indiana Fever that analysts danced around and media personalities softened with careful language. But eventually, people started saying what had been obvious for a while. The relationship between Caitlin Clark and head coach Stephanie White wasn't just complicated, it was philosophically broken. And when something is philosophically broken at the coaching level, no amount of talent can fully paper over it. You can win games, you can put up numbers, but the ceiling of what a team can become gets quietly lowered every single week that the disconnect goes unaddressed. That's what was happening in Indiana, and the people watching closely could see it building. The specific criticism that kept surfacing from analysts was pointed and consistent. The argument wasn't that Stephanie White was a bad coach in some general sense. It was something more precise and more damaging than that. The argument was that Indiana, across 2 consecutive off-seasons, appeared to be constructing a roster designed to function without Caitlin Clark at the center of everything, rather than building an infrastructure that maximized everything she brings to a basketball game. Those are 2 fundamentally different organizational philosophies, and the gap between them is enormous. One analyst put it plainly, saying the Fever had spent 2 off-seasons building a team to play without Caitlin Clark, rather than around her, and calling it clear as day. That's a brutal thing to say about a franchise that has the most marketable player in the history of women's basketball sitting in their locker room. But it wasn't said without reason. The roster construction decisions, the rotation patterns, the late-game tactical choices, all of it pointed in a direction that raised uncomfortable questions about what Indiana's leadership actually believed this team was supposed to be. The philosophical mismatch went deeper than X's and O's. It was about vision. It was about what kind of team you want to be when the biggest stage moments arrive. And when your superstar player and your head coach are operating from 2 completely different frameworks about how the game should be played and who it should be played through, you don't just have a tactical problem, you have a cultural one. There are specific moments that define a coaching relationship, and several of them during Clark's time in Indiana sent signals that were hard to ignore. The most talked about involved the handling of a situation with Alyssa Thomas that became a flashpoint for how White managed public defense of her own player. The expectation from Clark's supporters was straightforward. When your franchise cornerstone is involved in a physical altercation on the court, you stand in front of a microphone and you defend her, loudly, clearly, without ambiguity. That's what franchise players expect from their coaches, and historically, it's what great coaches have done when their stars needed them. It's part of the unwritten contract between a coach and a superstar. What happened instead was a 30-second statement that initially seemed to acknowledge the problem, followed by a walkback that many observers felt reframed the narrative in a way that put Clark's attacker in a more sympathetic light than her own player. For people already watching the relationship closely, it wasn't just a bad press conference moment. It felt like a confirmation of something they'd suspected for months.
More than they have leaned into her and built a team to play around her. They've spent 2 off seasons building a team to play without Caitlin Clark. It's clear as day. It's very simple, and I think the writing is pretty much already on the wall. At the end of the season, Kelsey Mitchell contract is up. Caitlin Clark is up for the Epic. Whatever. The Indiana Fever are going to be forced to pick a direction. They're either going to choose Kelsey Mitchell and Stephanie White, or they are going to choose
Every historic milestone that Clark achieved, analysts noted, seemed to be met with a kind of institutional silence from the coaching staff that struck many as tone-deaf at best. When a player is rewriting the record books in real time and the bench doesn't reflect that energy back to the arena, something is off. Fans notice it, players notice it, and eventually the player at the center of it notices it too. When the people who are supposed to champion your success seem more invested in maintaining a particular organizational structure than in celebrating what you're doing, the message lands whether it's intended or not. The quiet frustration that built around this dynamic wasn't about dramatic confrontations or locker room blow-ups. It was subtler and in some ways more corrosive than that. It was the slow accumulation of small moments that told a story about where the priorities of this organization actually lived. Here's what makes the Fever's situation genuinely complicated from a front office perspective. They don't have the luxury of unlimited time to figure this out. The contract situation is real, the clock is ticking, and the decisions that Indiana's leadership makes in the next stretch of time will define this franchise for the next decade. Kelsey Mitchell is an exceptional basketball player. Anyone who has watched her consistently understands her value. She is fast, she can score, and she has been a cornerstone of Indiana's identity for years before Clark arrived. But here's the uncomfortable reality that the Fever's front office has to confront directly. What does this roster look like if both Clark and Mitchell are here and the organizational philosophy doesn't shift to reflect what Clark needs to reach her ceiling? The analysis from people close to the situation has been blunt. Indiana is approaching a fork in the road where they either commit to building everything around Clark, which means making difficult decisions about contracts, rotations, and coaching philosophy, or they continue down a path that tries to balance multiple competing interests and ends up fully serving none of them. That kind of organizational indecision is how you waste a generational talent. It happens in men's basketball constantly, and the WNBA is not immune to it. The coaching situation adds another layer. If Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark genuinely cannot find a shared vision for what this team should be, then someone has to go. That's not a criticism, that's just the reality of how sports organizations function at the highest level. When the talent and the coaching philosophy are incompatible, the talent wins. It always wins, because the talent is what drives the economic engine of the franchise. Clark is Indiana's economic engine in a way that no player has ever been for this organization and possibly for any WNBA franchise in history. The pressure on Indiana's front office to get this right is not a background concern. It is the central organizational challenge of their existence right now. While Indiana was navigating its internal complications, something was shifting on the other side of the country that deserves serious attention. The Los Angeles Sparks, a franchise with a storied history but recent struggles, were undergoing a significant organizational transformation under their ownership group, the Walter Group, which also controls the Los Angeles Lakers. Ramona Shelburne, one of ESPN's most respected and connected reporters, specifically noted that the Sparks' ownership had become noticeably more involved with the franchise, describing it as more of an organizational shift than anything specific. That's carefully chosen language from someone who understands how these situations work.
When ownership becomes more hands-on, it signals ambition. It signals that the status quo is no longer acceptable and that significant changes are being considered at every level of the operation. The timing of this ownership energy shift matters enormously when you map it against everything happening in Indiana. The Sparks are a franchise with enormous market potential that has gone largely unrealized in recent years. Los Angeles is one of the most powerful media and endorsement markets in the world. A player of Clark's commercial profile in that market, with an engaged ownership group backing aggressive organizational moves, represents a completely different kind of opportunity than what currently exists in Indiana. Now, it's important to be clear about what has and hasn't been reported here. There have been significant rumors circulating online about specific dollar figures and formal offers being made to Clark. Much of what gets shared on social media presents speculation as confirmed fact, and that does a disservice to what is actually a genuinely fascinating real story. What is documented is that the Sparks ownership is energized, that they are making organizational moves, and that several players connected to Clark, including Cameron Brink, are already part of the Sparks world. What analysts are doing is connecting those documented dots and asking reasonable questions about where the franchise's ambitions might be pointing.
The speculation is worth discussing precisely because it reflects a real conversation happening around women's basketball right now about player movement, market power, and where the sport's biggest stars might ultimately end up. But the speculation should be labeled as speculation, and that distinction matters. Set aside the rumors for a moment and just think about what the Los Angeles market represents for a player in Clark's position. The endorsement infrastructure in that city is unmatched. The media attention, the entertainment crossover opportunities, the access to global brand partnerships, all of it operates at a completely different scale than what's available in Indianapolis. That's not a knock on Indiana. It's simply a reflection of the economic geography of American media and commerce. For a player who has already demonstrated that she can move commercial needles in ways that the sports industry rarely sees, the gap between what's possible in Los Angeles versus what's possible in Indiana is significant. The question of whether that commercial gap eventually becomes a factor in Clark's thinking about her career is not an unreasonable one. Athletes at the peak of their cultural influence have always considered market dynamics when evaluating their situations. That's not disloyalty, that's intelligence. The Sparks also represent something beyond just geography and market size. They represent an organizational fresh start, a place where the philosophical conflicts of the past 2 years don't exist, where the coaching staff and the front office could be constructed with Clark's specific needs and playing style as the foundation, rather than as a variable to be managed around. That kind of clean slate has enormous value for a player who has experienced the slow frustration of feeling like a square peg in an organizational round hole. Cameron Brink and Cade Martin both being in the LA orbit is not a trivial detail either. Clark's relationships with players on a potential destination team matter. The social and professional comfort of knowing people in a new environment accelerates the adjustment period and signals that the culture of a locker room might be a natural fit. These are the kinds of quiet factors that become significant when a player is genuinely evaluating options. One of the most revealing windows into Indiana's current situation isn't found in the star player drama, it's found in the bench. The conversations happening around the Fever's depth, rotation management, and the performance of non-starter players tell a story about organizational health that is just as important as anything happening at the top. Coach Lynn Roberts, who stepped into a difficult situation, spoke candidly about what she needed from her bench players. The message was about mental focus, next play mentality, and executing assignments without getting caught up in individual mistakes. That's the kind of thing a coach says when the gap between what the starters provide and what the bench can sustain is a genuine tactical concern. And in Indiana's current configuration, that gap is real. When Kelsey Plum went down with an injury for the Sparks, the conversation about bench depth exploded across the league because it highlighted how dependent certain teams are on their starting units. Indiana faces a version of that same vulnerability.
The minutes distribution, the role clarity for players like Kate Martin, Kiana Williams, and Emma Kennon, these are the details that matter enormously to the long-term competitive viability of the franchise, regardless of what happens with any individual star contract. Roberts was even asked directly about more aggressive substitution patterns, hockey-style line changes, and whether the team's depth could support that kind of rotation management. The fact that the question was being raised publicly suggests that people watching Indiana closely have noticed that the current approach to managing minutes and bench integration may not be optimized. When your bench can't reliably maintain the competitive standards set by your starters, you are one injury or one slump away from a serious problem. And for a franchise trying to build around a player of Clark's caliber, that vulnerability is something the front office needs to address with urgency. Here's the thing that makes this entire situation genuinely historic, beyond just the basketball. What is happening around Caitlin Clark right now is a live demonstration of how athlete leverage works in women's professional sports at a scale that simply never existed before in the WNBA's history.
Clark's commercial value is so significant, her presence so transformative for television ratings, ticket sales, and merchandise, that the normal power dynamics of the coach-player relationship and the franchise-player relationship have been fundamentally altered. In traditional sports business arrangements, the team holds most of the leverage. They control the contract, they control the roster, they control the environment. The player adapts or moves on. But when a player becomes more valuable to the league and to the sport's commercial ecosystem than any individual franchise, the leverage equation shifts. Clark isn't just valuable to Indiana. She is valuable to every broadcast partner, every sponsor, every arena that sells out when she walks through the door. That kind of pervasive economic value creates a situation where a player's well-being and professional satisfaction become matters of genuine institutional concern far beyond the walls of one franchise. What this means practically is that Indiana's front office is making decisions that are being watched not just by their own fans, but by the entire ecosystem of people with financial stakes in women's basketball. The pressure to get this right isn't just coming from Clark or from the fan base, it's coming from every entity that has invested in the growth of this sport over the past 2 years and that understands clearly and without ambiguity that she is the central reason those investments are paying off. The outcome of this organizational reckoning will set a precedent. How Indiana handles the coaching situation, the contract negotiations, the roster philosophy decisions, all of it will send a signal to every elite female athlete who comes behind Clark about whether the WNBA is an organization that protects and maximizes generational talent, or one that expects generational talent to adapt itself to existing bureaucratic structures. That signal matters enormously for the long-term health and credibility of the sport. The honest answer is that nobody outside of a very small group of people knows exactly how this resolves. What we do know is that the pressure points are real, they are building, and the decisions that get made in the next stretch of time will define Indiana's franchise for years. The coaching situation needs clarity. The roster philosophy needs to be stated explicitly and built toward consistently. The contract negotiations need to reflect what Clark actually means to this organization and to this league. If Indiana's front office gets this right, they have the foundation for something genuinely special. A generational player in her prime, a growing fan base hungry for winning basketball, and the commercial infrastructure to compete at the highest level. The potential is real, and it is significant. If they get it wrong, the consequences won't be quiet. The WNBA landscape is shifting faster than at any point in the league's history. Teams like the Sparks, with energized ownership and significant market advantages, are actively positioning themselves to capitalize on any organizational miscalculation by a competitor.
The window for Indiana to lock in what they have is open, but windows in professional sports don't stay open indefinitely. Clark herself has said very little publicly about any of this, which is itself a kind of statement. Players who are fully comfortable and fully committed to their organizations tend to say so. The silence isn't necessarily ominous, but it isn't nothing either. It's the sound of someone watching carefully and waiting to see what the people around her actually do when it matters. The global audience watching women's basketball right now is bigger than it has ever been. The stakes for getting this right have never been higher. And the next move belongs to Indiana. What do you think happens? Does the Fever front office make the changes necessary to keep Clark long-term, or does this become the moment that redefined where the sport's biggest star builds her legacy? Drop your thoughts below and make sure you're subscribed, because when this story moves, it is going to move fast.